So I'm Rivera Sun, an author and an activist and an educator in nonviolent movements, and I'm here in Milwaukee on a beautiful rainy day having a conversation with Mark Foreman from the Veterans for Peace at the Urban Ecology Center for Green TV.
I'm Mark Foreman. I'm a veteran of the Vietnam War. I was a Navy corpsman with the Marines in 1968, where I was wounded quite severely. Spent nearly a year in the hospital. When I got out, my life was rather shattered, and I decided to go in the direction of art. So I went to art school, became a stone sculptor for 10 years. After that, I decided I wanted to share my joy of art with children, so I went back to school and became certified to teach. And I taught in the Milwaukee Public Schools for 20 years. I've been retired now for 10 years, and in that time I've co-founded the Milwaukee Homeless Veterans Initiative, where we've been able to help most of the homeless veterans in Milwaukee in that 7-year period find shelter and clothing and food. And it's really part of my therapy from the Vietnam War. Well, Rivera, I've heard about you, and I've heard about your book, The Dandelion Insurrection. And I would love to hear more about what that is about. Can you explain that?
Sure. So the Dandelion Insurrection is a story about nonviolent movement for change in the United States just around the corner today. So it takes some of the problems that we're looking at right now, like the climate crisis, lack of democracy, the income inequality, the involvement of the corporations in our politics, so many of the problems that we know about in our world, and it just makes them a little bit more deeper, a little bit more darker, and a little bit more recognizable amongst the populace. And says when we get to that tipping point of being fed up about this, what are we going to do? And what the characters in the book do is they turn to tools of Gandhi and King and Chavez and so many other nonviolent movements all around the world that have worked for change. And it tells a fictional story that may be something similar to what we could find in our own lives too.
Fascinating. Yeah, well, as a veteran of the U.S. military, I've learned that there is so much waste going on, and that the militarization of the United States is leading us off the cliff. And so when I hear about people like yourself, I get excited that you are sending a message that we are in a crisis and that we need to change our values, otherwise we're going to fall over the cliff. So I'm really glad to be meeting you and hearing more about what you're doing.
I think you hit something right on the nose with the values question. You know, in the Dandelion Insurrection, the characters come together from the right and from the left, from the rural and the urban, around the shared themes of love, life, and liberty. So this common value that we actually share as Americans of wanting our civil liberties protected, not just the Second Amendment, but especially the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment, which are increasingly becoming important to people in today's over-militarizing, over-policed, over-surveilled state.
Right. And as a veteran of war, I've seen what violence is capable of at the extreme. And I came out of that experience, as many of us who belong to Veterans for Peace came out of that experience knowing that if we don't stop this militarization, not only of this country but of the world, that we are all going to perish. And it boils down to survival. The whole thing is we now, for the first time in human history, are capable of destroying human life on this planet. And we have a choice to make. And you are presenting this choice, I think, in a really wonderful way, which helps us veterans have hope for the future. appreciate that a lot.
So I think you brought up a lot of great points in that, Mark, particularly about the role that the U.S. military is playing in fueling not just the climate catastrophe that we're facing, but also global unrest at this time in which climate issues are intensifying problems around resources and scarcity. And then the fact that, as U.S. taxpayers, more than half of our money is going directly into a military apparatus that is fueling conflict around the world. And one thing that we're looking at in nonviolent movements for change, which is something besides novel writing that I put a lot of work into, is how do we transform this situation using the over 200 methods of nonviolent action that are available to us. So what other options besides picking up guns or arms and waging conflict in that way do we have as citizens for creating the change that we really desperately need to see? And how do we work our political system, which has a severe lack of democracy going on, into a system in which we can actually pull back some of the funding on the military budget, redirect it, put it into the types of projects that we're going to need to address the causes of climate change, and then also the ongoing problems of climate change that we will have to deal with in our world.
You mentioned that you've been in 30 different cities in this spring, and here it is, not even June yet. Are you getting a sense that there are more and more Americans who are getting involved with trying to figure out and be a part of this movement to save the earth?
Well, I think one thing we are observing is more and more citizens getting involved in what I like to call the movement of movements. So we have many, many movements, some like Black Lives Matter, protesting police brutality, some like Occupy-related movements that are protesting income inequality, some like climate justice movements. But across the board, we are seeing a marked increase of citizens getting involved in at least one or two or many of those movements for change. And so what we're seeing is a growing culture of active citizenry and active nonviolence kind of rising up to address the issues that we're facing.
So you're seeing that there are, just like us in Veterans for Peace, we are seeing that there is this need for not only peace abroad, but peace at home. There's this growing disparity going on in our country in particular. And I think more and more Americans are understanding that. And we are starting to put our energy into the problems of injustice at home, as well as the injustice that the U.S. military is involved in so many countries around the world, and not in very positive ways. It's more that they want to, the United States foreign policy seems to want to take over the whole world, and they will stop at nothing to do that. And so your book and your training to get people, to help people to understand how to organize nonviolently is really important. And Veterans for Peace really appreciates what you're doing, because we're trying to figure it out as we go along too, how to organize people who really care about what the U.S. military is doing. And you said it earlier that at least 50% of the government, the taxes that we pay in this country, are going to build up an even more powerful military that is positioning itself to, as we see it, destroy a lot of life on Earth. And so I guess, you and organizations like Veterans for Peace are wanting to get our message out, that this is what we see, and a lot of people are seeing the same thing, and all we got to do is somehow figure out how to non-violently force the powers that be to stop from polluting the earth and killing life on Earth.
We're seeing arising right now, the very phenomenon which you're describing for me and Veterans for Peace is happening all across the board with many, many people who are seeing that all the issues are interconnected with one another, and that when we work together collaboratively, when we find our shared common cause, we become stronger together. And we are no longer siloed or isolated or marginalized, but we actually are in a position of great strength, the diverse kind of strength, that we don't have to homogify in order to move forward, that we can actually use our diversity as our power together, that in a democracy, we want that kind of diversity of perspective. But we do want to find ways to strategically work together, and that's a lot of what I'm doing the trainings around, is bringing people together in a room, looking at analysis of what the situation is that we're in, finding out where our issues overlap, and then how we can really be strategic about nonviolent action. So we're not just petitioning, we're not just protesting, that we are, like Fight for 15, like Black Lives Matter, like some of the climate justice struggles on frontline communities that are blockading tanks and oil tanks and pipelines and trains and things like that, using tactics of disruption, non-cooperation, civil disobedience, strikes, boycotts, occupations, sit-ins, slowdowns, work stoppages. We've seen many good actions coming out of labor unions for a variety of issues that relate to war, poverty, and the climate crisis. Now, this group that I work with as well, Campaign Nonviolence, which is a project by Pache Ibene, which is a 30-year-old peace and justice and nonviolence institution. What it's really doing is looking at those three issues, war, poverty, and climate crisis, and creating a system by which everyone in this country can get exposure to nonviolence, both as a personal practice, an interpersonal practice, and a social and political set of tools. And we can shift and transform this very destructive, very violent culture that we are all a part of into a culture of active nonviolence, from ourselves to our social political systems to our very military. We can hardly imagine the kind of resources that are going to be freed up in our society for positive, constructive work when we actually have a military that understands its role in this globe as one that is here for minimal defense. I won't say that there aren't better ways to do that. I won't say that that's not necessary, but that, there is a role for people who think we need a military, but that many of our resources that are going into the military right now could be better directed into creating equality and justice, the real causes of peace and security in this world.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that as a veteran for peace?
As a veteran, having seen war, like I said before, and the destruction and the waste, and coming back from the war and slowly realizing that the United States only represents less than 5% of the world population, and yet we consume somewhere around 30 to 40% of the world's resources. Those values are unsustainable. And, as I question, what are we fighting for? And a lot of veterans, I'm very sad to say, are committing suicide. And active duty soldiers are committing suicide. And I think it's because we realize that our government is asking us to do these abominable things overseas, and now there's this militarization of police forces in our country that are doing it to our own citizens. And so, what you're saying is that you're seeing many different organizations, not only in this country, people coming together and realizing that we are all in this together, and that if we are to stop the madness of the militarization of this planet, of the materialism that is consuming resources at an unsustainable rate. As a veteran, what on earth are we doing overseas, killing so many people with drones now to dehumanize the whole process of, I think, U.S. foreign policy is to take over the world. And people all around the world are getting very disgusted with the United States and our values. And if we lived in other parts of the world, you know, that are being attacked by the United States in these endless wars, we would begin to hate the United States. And I think because we are veterans who have seen what the U.S. military does to people in other parts of the world, and now they're moving it towards here in this country, towards people of color in particular. We understand what you're saying and what you're doing, and really appreciate that you're wanting to be a part of the healing of America.
Well, you know, that's really one of the roles that I personally, on a very personal note, as an author, I hope to play in this whole transformation that we're looking at. That in writing the Dandelion Insurrection, I really sat down with this question of transformation, that so many of our movies, books, stories, video games are all posited around the plot line of violence and warfare. And I said, well, you know, actually by the statistics, nonviolent struggles are succeeding twice as often as violent struggles in the world. This is a new set of database statistics, very exciting.
Yep.
And since that's the actual factual case, maybe our literature needs to reflect that. Maybe we need to start busting up the myth of violence, the myth of warfare, and replacing it with the truth that we as human beings are discovering about nonviolent movements for change. And so that's one of the goals of the Dandelion Insurrection, is to give people a story that's actually reflective of what's going on in the world, something that really pulls together some of these tools and resources and shows all of the adventure, all of the excitement, all of the character development, all of the moments of finding courage and heroism that we normally associate with violence or wartime conflict, and say you don't need to be killing each other in order to have an epic adventure, an epic story of our time, to find oneself as a human being. And the Dandelion Insurrection is really a story about that.
Beautiful. That's great. And I just want to say that we are one in wanting to extend life. And Veterans for Peace was created in 1985, 10 years after the end of the Vietnam War, by veterans who were in the war that saw the waste and carnage. And we're here to tell you that this is not the solution. War is not the solution. And for the viewers, if anyone is interested in contacting Veterans for Peace, you can just go to our website, which is veteransforpeace.org. And maybe, Rivera, you want to tell people how to get your book.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. If anyone is interested in finding a copy of the Dandelion Insurrection, it can be ordered from all the major online booksellers. They can also special order it through their local independent bookstores, or they can go directly to my website, which is www.riverasun.com. And I love hearing from readers, so don't be shy. And Mark, thank you so much for having this conversation with me, and let's make it the start of many.
I hope so. It was a pleasure to meet you, and I wish you